asking the questions mainstream journalists will never ask. This is your Richie Allen Show on richieallen.co.uk, Fab Radio 2 in Manchester, and triggerwarning.tv.
Well, to say that we love our next guest is it's an understatement. He's an amazing man. He's an economist and author, of course, of books like The Failure of Laissez-Faire Capitalism, How America Was Lost, many others as well. Check out paulcraigroberts.org. That's his website. And, of course, he is most well known, I suppose, for being a one-time US Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Great guy, and we love that he gives us his time. Mr. Paul Craig Roberts, welcome back. How are you?
Thanks, Richie. Well, we made it by the skin of our teeth. The internet was out, and they fixed it 2 minutes before you called.
Yeah, you've had a few issues with internet. We've had some around here as well, locally. They're trying to upgrade everybody to this super speed, 300 meg speed or whatever it is. That's the problem. I thought of you on Tuesday. I was at the Rolling Stones in Manchester on Tuesday, Mick Jagger, and I thought of you because somebody said to me, isn't Jagger great jumping around the stage at 74? And I said, he hasn't met Paul Craig Roberts, who's the multitasker extraordinaire. Great to have you back on. I'm going to ask you straight up. Back in the late winter, you were very concerned that circumstances were conspiring to possibly push us to the brink of a nuclear conflict. You wrote about it on paulcraigroberts.org. You made some very good points, and you had some good reasons for thinking that. At the time, people said, because of your experience and because of who you are, people said, wow, Paul is basically saying that, we're looking at World War III. Do you still feel we're close to a conflict like that, or have things occurred recently to maybe give you a moment of pause? What do you think?
Well, I think we've lucked out because, the real danger was the last fake chemical attack in Syria. The real danger was that the Trump regime was going to attack and hit Russian forces as well as Syrian. And that would have forced Putin into a war situation, which he very diplomatically avoids. But the U.S. military got on the phone with the Russian military, and they worked out that fake attack that didn't actually do any real damage anywhere, but let the Trump regime save face. So that showed that the two militaries were able to work this out despite the politician in the White House. So that was a big relief. I have been concerned still that President Putin's willingness to accept so many provocations and so many insults in order to avoid conflict, but that this acceptance of them encourages them from Washington, because Washington reads that as a lack of nerve on the part of Putin and the Russians. And so it encourages Washington to get more extreme in its provocations. And so I remained concerned that just the extremity of the provocations would eventually force the war. Now, however, I am further reassured because of Trump's ability to alienate all of Washington's European vassal states. With this pulling out of the Iranian agreement and now threatening all of Europe with sanctions equivalent to those he says he's going to add to Iran, so that you now have the Europeans reassessing their close cooperation with Washington, because it's becoming just too costly. We've seen the statements by Merkel in Germany, which I thought was surprising, that they can't trust the Americans anymore. We saw the statements by Juncker, the head of the EU, who says that it's time to stop fussing at Russia and to make friends, and that Europe has to find its own way independently of the Americans. So if we see the empire breaking up under Trump's economic assault, he's even threatened Germany.
Yeah, who hasn't he threatened?
Yeah, if they go ahead with that Nord 2 gas pipeline, he's threatened Germany with all kinds of sanctions. So this sort of shows that Putin's bet seems to be paying off. His bet was, I'll just sit here, accept the insults, accept the provocations, and sooner or later, Washington will ruin itself with the Europeans. And when it ruins itself with the Europeans, it'll lose its forward bases, the NATO thing. All of this can come unwound, and we can avoid a conflict, because without Europe, Washington really can't produce the kinds of conflict arrangements that it's been trying to produce with Russia. So I am more relieved. It's still dangerous because the neoconservatives still control Washington. They still control the security agencies. They still control the Trump White House. One of the most notorious ones is the UN ambassador, Nikki Haley. But even here, I'm encouraged because I saw her effort to get some sort of an American proposed resolution through that essentially gives Israel free hand to slaughter the Palestinians. Didn't get a single vote.
Not one. Not
one. Except hers.
Except her own, yeah.
So again, it's sort of an indication that the world maybe has had enough of American bullying. And it may well be that the way Trump causes normalization of relations with Russia is by inadvertently breaking up the American empire.
Yeah. But let me put this to you. This is really good stuff, this, because I've been thinking, obviously I've been reading, Paul's written about this extensively lately. Go to paulcraigroberts.org and read his articles. What if, now hear me out now before you jump straight down my throat, but what if, right? What if the European Union is the big bogeyman here? Putin was on Austrian television the other day. I thought it very interesting. And he said that terrorism is, we got to fight terrorism, and I'd like to be part of some European security arrangement, some sort of agreement. What if the European Union, which of course has become ever more seeking more and more political and financial union to become this big super state, what if that's his real enemy? You know where I'm going with this? What if Putin his real danger is not the neocon, Jewish supremacist controlled White House, but the growth of the fascist superstate that is the European Union? What do you think, Paul?
Well, that's an interesting idea, Richie, and it could develop that way. On the other hand, I doubt that the European Union would ever be able to produce the kinds of military armaments and armies that would be of any consequence to Russia. I think also just the general area of Europe is too small. And I think also, don't we see indications that the EU itself is having trouble? For example, Italy now has elected two anti-establishment parties, and they now control the legislature and have the right to form the government. The establishment president, I think, spent about 3 months trying to block that, but hasn't been successful. So we see then the rise of anti-establishment political parties in Italy. So it kind of looked, and we see other statements from Eastern European members of the EU that show they're very unhappy. For example, the Austrian president, Orban in Hungary, these people are not speaking the EU language. So that you see a rising dissatisfaction within the EU itself. Now, I have always understood that the EU itself was a CIA creation, in the sense that the CIA wanted a unified Europe because it's easier to control the EU than to control all the independent countries. And, the United States was very much frustrated by Charles de Gaulle's unwillingness to join NATO or to follow American direction. In fact, a number of people believe that the various assassination attempts on de Gaulle that were blamed on the Algerian, the French army that had been fighting in Algeria to keep control of the colony, blaming them because de Gaulle left that war and turned Algeria over to Algerians. A lot of people think actually these were CIA attempts because he wouldn't join NATO, he wouldn't cooperate with Washington. So it's entirely possible that the EU itself is going to come apart. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And the way it's worked in recent years, and we've discussed this on your program, essentially the EU plundered Greece, plundered Portugal.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and more or less intimidated Spain. I don't know if they got to the plunder part or not, but they certainly got the government changed. And we know that the previous effort in Italy was frustrated by the EU, that
the finance minister. They wanted appointed,
They appointed all the ministers of the government. They appointed the prime minister. The guy was a Goldman Sachs banker.
Absolutely.
In charge of Italy. So this shows the kinds of dissatisfaction with the EU. And I think all of the immigration, all the people fleeing Washington's wars, plus everybody who used that to join in to be an immigrant too. And these wars were supported by the Europeans. So now all this immigration and all the problems from that. And so it may well be that the EU is just not going to hang together, that the interests are too diverse. And what it really implies is the subordination of the Southern Europeans to the Northern ones. And if they're not willing to have that subordination, then the EU can break apart. It also means that the Eastern Europeans have to be subordinate to the Western. But their alternative is Russia. So I think we could enter a more hopeful era. What the Israelis and the neoconservatives in Washington will do, though, that we don't know, because it's still the case that the Israelis want to be rid of Syria and Iran, because Syria and Iran supply Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is the defense of southern Lebanon from Israel. And Israel wants to occupy southern Lebanon for various reasons, and one of the most important is the water resources. So the Israelis are used to prevailing. They're used to using Washington to fight their wars. They've been doing it for 17 years, if not longer. And these people don't quit easily. And the neoconservatives are very much dedicated to their ideology of American hegemony. They don't want to give that up. And then you have all the various kinds of economic interests in Washington, represented in Washington. You know, the big American banks, they like the financial hegemony. They want to keep that. The oil companies like to be able to control the location of pipelines and the flows. I think they're less interested in owning them than they are in controlling the flows of oil and the location of the pipeline. So all of those interests are still alive. And they're not going to just go away and quit. But I do think it's more hopeful now. But of course, all of this European criticism of Trump and the talk about trade wars and all of that, that could just be the Europeans posturing for more money. Because as we've also discussed on your show, the United States has a long tradition of purchasing European political leaders. You know, as I've told you before, my dissertation chairman, who ended up in a very powerful position in the government, told me that when I asked him, how is it we get other countries to always do what we want? He said, money. I said, oh, you mean foreign aid? He says, no, bagfuls of money. We give their leaders bagfuls of money. We own them. They report to us. So, and of course, the same is true of the media. We know that from the book that Udo Ulfoki wrote.
That's German, right, the German, yeah. Amazing book.
That there's no significant journalist in Europe that's not on the CIA payroll. Now, he's got no reason to make that up. I mean, it didn't do him any good to say that.
No, to say the least.
And so these kinds of connections are strong. And I don't, you know, the notion that they're just going to completely unravel suddenly and go away. But I think they're certainly under stress. And I think Trump, being a bully and blusterer, he kind of fits in with the belligerence of the neoconservatives. And he seems to be comfortable with them. So they are probably stronger in Washington than they've been since George W. Bush, when they ran the whole show. But they've made this comeback despite all the failures of their wars in the Middle East. But on the other hand, I think Putin's diplomacy, his patience, his restraint, I think the Europeans are finding him more reassuring than Washington. So if the Europeans would actually tend to their own interests rather than Washington's, and start representing European peoples instead of whoever's in the White House, which is all they've done for 75 years. All the European politicians have done for 75 years is kowtow to Washington. Except de Gaulle.
Which in turn kowtows to Israel's interests. On the European Union, by the way, Paul has written about this this week. In fact, in the last day or two, democracy is fighting to survive the rise of Western authoritarianism. Go to paulcraigroberts.org and read it. I've seen countries, Paul, in the last 15 years try to get away from the European Union. Twice my own country, the Republic of Ireland, voted no to the Lisbon and Nice treaties. Then we were sent back. The Danes tried to leave, were sent back. The French voted against a referendum, they were sent back. We all thought, well, I didn't think, it was one of the few things I got right, but back in 2014 when Alexis Tsipras took Syriza into power in Greece and he seemed to be anti-European, I predicted that he would capitulate and that Greece would be worse off than it was. It turned out that I was right. We've seen, as you mentioned yourself, the new government in Italy, they wanted Paolo Savona, who's actually against the single currency. They wanted him to be finance minister. The European Union said no, and the parties acquiesced. And you probably know this because you've got your eyes on what's happening in the UK. But our decision to leave the European Union, taken in 2016, that's just been laughed at and been thrown out the window. Today we learned that we're going to be in the European Union till about 2022, at the very least, whether we like it or not. Paul, you're familiar, of course, with the music of the Eagles. You can check out any time you like, Paul, but you can never leave. It's a
right.
It's a fascist dictatorship, isn't it? It survives and survives and survives, despite the fact that right across, as you have so properly stated, right across Southern Europe and the Republic of Ireland, which has been destroyed economically by membership of the European Union, despite all of this rebellion, all this revolt by ordinary people like me and you and our listeners against it, it doesn't matter. It marches on, the European Union.
Yes, it does. It marches on, but we see stronger and stronger resistance. And I think this vote in Italy, where the establishment simply lost control.
Yeah.
And the reason the two parties had to accept the compromise finance minister was that the president of Italy was able, using, I think, probably inappropriately, powers of the presidency to actually prevent them from forming the government that they had a right to from the election. So I think the whole formation of the government was delayed at least for 3 months. And so I can see the parties would say, look, let's just go ahead and get this thing going so that we ourselves don't lose the people's confidence.
They shouldn't have done that, am I right? Am I right to say they should not have done that? They should have told the EU where to go, off a cliff. Come on, Paul. You can't bow down to these tyrants.
I agree. I have the same response to it that you do, Richie. On the other hand, I can see that the delay in being able to form a government can be used against the new parties by the establishment, pointing out, well, look, you voted for them 3 months ago and they still haven't got a government. And so I think they were rightfully concerned, maybe too concerned, but it's right to have some concern that they would lose the confidence of people if they couldn't form a government. And most people believe that some kind of compromise is okay. So as long as they didn't give away the election.
Yeah, I hear you.
But it would be hard for Italy alone to pull out of the EU. It needs to be something that several countries do together, because it's harder to gang up on several than one. The big banks in the United States, Germany, Holland, they could smash the Italian currency without any trouble.
That's a good point, Paul. Can I just I don't like interrupting you, but let me just jump in there. That's a hugely important point you're making there. Ambrose Evans Pritchard, who's a very good writer for the Telegraph newspaper, he absolutely endorses what you said. He said if the Italians or the Greeks reintroduced their historic currency, devalued it, which would be the right thing to do, he said what you said. He said that basically they'd be destroyed by the European Central Bank, the IMF, and they wouldn't have security in numbers. They wouldn't have Spain on their side or Portugal or the Republic of Ireland. It's a very good point, that. Because people always ask me that. Why don't they devalue their own currency, get rid of the euro, and tell the European Union to take a running jump? Because they would be attacked unmercifully.
Yeah, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, most likely the Bank of Tokyo, because the Japanese answer to Washington, just like the Germans do, or have been. They would just all step in and short the currency and drive it down to zero. They would just short it. And, look, remember what one person, George Soros, did to the British pound.
Remember that?
That was years ago, and England was even stronger then. And so if one person could do that to a reserve currency, because the pound was a reserve currency, still is to some extent, you can see what powerful central banks could do to countries of very light financial weight, like Greece and Italy and Portugal and Spain. They would be massacred. So, and they would be.
Yeah, they would.
And they know it.
They know it, yeah. Yeah, because when I was covering Greece, I had Greek journalists on, and we talked about that. I had people on from Katharimini, the English newspaper in Greece, and we were talking about what the Greeks really needed to do. And then Tsipras told the Greeks to reject the bailout terms. The Greeks did, and then he sold them down the river. There is, I know you know this, but you are in the States. There is absolute disillusion, Paul, particularly in the United Kingdom, as Theresa May, the UK Prime Minister, seems to be, well, it isn't seems to be, she is capitulating to the European Union instead of walking away and maybe going to World Trade Organization terms for trading and tell these guys, to take a running jump. But again, you've suggested there that even the UK, even with its own currency, could suffer if they were to do that, if they were to say, no deal whatsoever, we leave now and we do whatever we want. You probably reckon, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, that the repercussions, the recriminations from Brussels might be devastating in the short term anyway for the UK.
Or from Washington.
Or from Washington, right.
Yeah, because, we've made it clear that we don't approve of the UK leaving the EU. And so, as we discussed long ago, I don't expect that Brexit will happen. And certainly the Bank of England knows that if the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank come after the pound, that it can't do anything about it. So, the price of Brexit, it has to be known in British ruling circles, will be an attack on the pound. And the whole effort will be to convince the British it was a mistake so that the decision is reversed.
Yeah.
So what this shows is the kind of fascism you mentioned earlier. And I would put it slightly different. I would say that what it shows is that no European country is independent. There are things that they simply can't do, even though they're sovereign, because they'll be punished for it if they do it. And so there are very limited ways in which any European country can express its sovereignty. And this sovereignty is gradually disappearing within the EU. And this is why I am happy to see fissures in the EU. The Italian vote, the statements that come out of Austria, come out of Hungary, elsewhere.
Spain, yeah.
That the thing may fail. And I think if Europe breaks from Washington, which they should do, in the interest of their own survival, because if Europe stays united with Washington, Washington is eventually going to succeed in forcing Russia into a war. And of course, Europe would be the first to disappear. And there's no bringing it back.
No.
So if the Europeans were aware of the danger of the situation of being America's ally when the United States is hell-bent to reduce the sovereignty of a powerful country like Russia, they're asking for their own destruction. So they should break and tend to their own interest and make whatever deals serve them best with the Russians, with the Americans, with whoever, but cease being vassal states of Washington. And there are many reasons they did that. There was the Soviet threat, which was always overblown. They got a free ride in their defense budgets. They got a free ride in trade with Washington. They got a free ride in using whatever mechanisms Washington put in place. They didn't have to do the development. They didn't have to have the expense. So it was easy for politicians because it reduced pressures on their budgets to have the Americans paying and doing these things. So you can see what happened. But now the cost is coming home, and I think that they have an incentive to go their own way. And I think even if this Italian revolt gets put down, like the Greek one, and the Hungarian one is put down, we're trying to overthrow this guy in Hungary. I mean, I think you know that, right?
Yeah.
And so if we overthrow him, but there's still clearly
cracks,
dissatisfaction.
Yeah, fissures you call them. There's fissures appearing. I want to ask you this just before, because we're going to run out of time in a couple of minutes. Since we last spoke, Bashar al-Assad gave a very good interview to Russia Today, the first in-depth interview that he'd given for about 6 months. And he seemed to be in good spirits and good form. Obviously, they've driven the jihadists pretty much out of, well, they've gone from Damascus. They've reclaimed so much of Syria. And I think they're hiding in Idlib now, I think, or somewhere in that region. It looks like the attempt to overthrow Syria using these Western-backed lunatics is failing. So the final question for you this evening, and thanks again, Paul, for giving us your time. You know how much I appreciate it. The question is, what are the Zionists and the neocons likely to do now that unleashing the head-chopping lunatics hasn't succeeded? What's the next step?
Well, I think what the United States is occupying part of that territory. And we now have troops there, and I think we got France to put some troops there. So I think what they were hoping to do was to have another false flag attack that would justify an attack on Syria by the United States and Israel. And the Russian sort of timidity allowing Israel to attack Syria was encouraging that. So, but I think what has stopped that is the other fake things have blown up in their face, like the alleged assassination by Russia of the journalist in Ukraine. You know about that, right?
Yeah.
And that's blown up on them. He wasn't assassinated. They told a lie, and they told another lie about why they told it. We have this whole thing about the guy in Salisbury, England, which allegedly poisoned by. That's blown up.
Yeah.
The last false flag chemical attack in Syria, what was it, Duma? That's blown up. There wasn't any attack at all. It was all made up, fake news. So now it's kind of hard to pull off another fake news because people are going to be more suspicious. And it's probably going to get branded another false flag attack. So I don't know what they're going to do, but I don't think they're going to quit.
They won't quit. Here's one for you, Paul, just briefly. What about another manipulated global financial meltdown? That's a tool they love, cause chaos by crashing the markets every year. What do you think? Causing huge problems for people's individual savings and all of that, houses. What do you think?
Well, that's dangerous to them too. See, it's not just dangerous to people in the market and ordinary people, but it's dangerous to them too, because the whole dollar-based global system now is so endangered. It's such a house of cards. Everything is based on endless creation of money and misreporting of inflation, misreporting of employment. A crash now, probably they'd lose control. Unemployment would be high. There'd be problems. There'd be political problems. There'd be more support for non-establishment parties like Marine Le Pen. You would see these kinds of developments. I don't think they want that. In fact, I think they're doing all they can. I don't think it would work for them.
So you don't see that as an immediate danger then? Because a lot of our listeners...
It may happen because they can't do anything about it.
Yeah. I
mean, it's all the conditions for it to fall apart are there. And they keep it together with money. You know, if we're not printing the money, the Japanese are, or the European Central Bank is. Someone's always, as long as there's liquidity from central banks going into the financial markets, the prices stay up. So they're doing everything they can to keep, all the glue and the strings holding things together still attached.
They have used those crashes in the past, though, to grab what we call real wealth, haven't they? Land and utilities and everything. It's something they've done. And then, of course, they bring austerity in then to pay for it, which is even worse for people. Keeps us dumbed down. Yeah.
They tend to do that to other countries.
To other countries, yeah. But we've had it here. We've had it in this country and in the Republic of Ireland. We're just about out of time for today. You and I, please God, will talk again real soon. It's summertime now, and I know with the grandchildren and everything, you probably have plans for the summer, so I don't know whether to leave you alone for a couple of months or to give you a shout next month. How are you fixed?
Richie, I'm always willing to talk to you, and I'm always working. And so anytime so inclined, just give me an email. We'll arrange it.
Of course I will. I told you earlier, Mick Jagger's got nothing on you, the Rolling Stones. These guys think they work hard. Nobody works harder than Paul. Folks, you've just been listening to the former US Assistant Secretary of the Treasury and the author and journalist Paul Craig Roberts. His website, bookmark it, put it on your menu bar, is paulcraigroberts.org. Regular articles from Paul and guests challenging the official narrative, challenging the BS that we're fed on a daily basis by the mainstream media. Paul, thanks so much again for your time today. I really appreciate it, and we'll do it again real soon. Thanks a lot.
I look forward to it, Richie.
Cheers, my friend. Bye for now. The great Paul Craig Roberts live on the line to us there from Virginia today. Great to have him on.